Hello, and thank you for logging into this presentation about the empirical sublime, ice, Antarctica, and the poetry of Elizabeth Bradfield and Jean McNeil. The sublime has a long history of association with writing about Antarctica, from the time when James Cook reached for the language associated with it to describe the qualities of the environment he was travelling through, to more recent writing about the continent, which acknowledges its importance as an aesthetic category with evolving cultural, literary, and environmental significance. Both as substance and symbol, Antarctic ice functions as a paradigm study for the impacts of climate change on the environment. It is a materialization of the movement of time on a sublime scale. Binding time past, the ice record, with time present and future time, computer modelling based on historic data, it brings together earlier traditions of the sublime in literature and landscape with ideas about the sublime as it is implicated in climate change. Representations of ice in the poetry of Jean McNeil and Elizabeth Bradfield give expression to what might be termed an empirical sublime, full of measure and number, rooted in a sensory and intellectual interrogation of the material world, which is not limited to an Antarctic context. Their poetry demonstrates one way in which the sublime as an aesthetic response to the environment feeds into moral appreciation and therefore the possibility of appropriate action. The difficulties associated with the expression of the empirical and theoretical basis of the sublime, the slippage between the initial phenomenological experience, writing about this experience, and the second-order discussion based on that experience, contribute to the instability of any definition. However, it is precisely its slipperiness as a concept, the way it inhabits spaces between language, the senses, and the natural world, which make the sublime a useful lens through which to consider Antarctic writing. In Edmund Burke's terms, everything about the polar regions, particularly the Antarctic, is sublime. Vast, dangerous, and extreme, those who travel there can experience terrible privations and become lost in the obscurity of a whiteout, or blinded by a light so bright it appears like darkness. Antarctic writing also needs to take account of the language and experience of scientists. The continent is a touchstone for the Earth's systems, and the science done there is committed to investigating global warming and developing our understanding of global ecology. Jean McNeil confirms the importance of scientific language in the introductions to Ice Diaries. Science is a way of seeing things clearly, a process of revelation, she writes, describing its language as at once a part of the Antarctic world and an instrument by which any revelation gained there is expressed. This view of language as both part of the world and as an expression of it echoes the slippage in ways of experiencing and writing about the sublime. Number and measure, with their implied precision, are the apparent opposite of uncertainty. However, when Timothy Morton describes global warming in hyperobjects, he deliberately evokes the sublime through number. 7% of global warming effects will still be occurring 100,000 years from now as igneous rocks slowly absorb the last of the greenhouse gases. I have decided to call these timescales the horrifying, the terrifying, and the petrifying. The scale of the catastrophe is evoked time and again in statistics which are aimed to rouse us to action. The sublime icescape, which posed such a threat to the men travelling across it, has been replaced by global warming and the idea of the Anthropocene as a source of the sublime. Dr. Gorham, from the University of Hawaii, featured in Werner Herzog's documentary Encounters at the End of the World, makes it clear that something more than the material world can be apprehended through measurement. We are trying to make contact with that otherworldly universe of neutrinos. And as a physicist, even though I understand it mathematically, and I understand it intellectually, it still hits me in the gut that there is something here, around, surrounding me, almost like some kind of spirit or God that I can't touch, but I can measure it. I would suggest that there is a case for adding another strain to the taxonomy of the sublime to take account of the field of Antarctic science. In an attempt to bridge the gap between what is known and what is not understood, between what is intimated but not felt on the body, to convey the sense of an almost overwhelming higher order, not necessarily divine, in a sublime landscape. The scientist's reaching for numbers and measurement can be read as an expression of the sublime in its second phase, where reason tries to make sense of the experience. Writers who take account of science and of the Antarctic scientist in their writing about the continent will find their work is modified by number and measure. Such work might be termed an expression of the empirical sublime. Reflecting on the writing of Toward Antarctica, Elizabeth Bradfield remarked that her journey, which the volume records, was an opportunity to ground truth what I'd written in my 2010 collections of poems Approaching Ice, identifying it as an empirical test of her earlier imaginative representations of the continent from the perspective of someone who had not been there. The Haibun in the later collection combines echoes of note form like field notes with short poems and documentary photographs. Her tone is measured and her approach empirical. The sublime as it is figured here appears in the dissolution of boundaries between generic forms. Like the sublime, the Antarctic experience is a limit experience, a threshold place marked by vast sentinels of ice. Poetry about the continent is drawn into a consideration of this experience of ice and time, of human responsibility for what is happening on a planetary scale. Whilst the poetry of Jean McNeil has the sublime within its compass, Night Orders, the collection of poems written after her residencies in the Arctic and the Antarctic, eschews its traditional language in favour of the language of science, its terminology, a syntax which echoes the language of field notes and observations, and the visual language of graphs, photographs and diagrams. Time in Night Orders is noted, observed, its qualities felt with other forces at work in nature. Each of the sections of ice observations begins with a date into time, showing a movement through the sequence towards winter, a linear, chronological progress. For readers of the poem, they are also part of the evocation of place, echoing as they do the tradition of observation, journal and record keeping, which makes up a large part of the literature of Antarctic exploration. Whilst they suggest a sequence of precise times, the gaps between them gesture to the disorienting temporal and spatial landscape surrounding the writer. Time markers become a means of orientation. In such an environment, empirical language gains the resonance of metaphor. The title of the poem, Glacier, 11 p.m., illustrates several aspects of an empirical sublime. It is economical and precise. The temporal and spatial position of the speaker is made clear. The glacier, a river of ice, embodies subjective understanding of time. It contains both ancient ice and the water of its future melting. 11 p.m. represents the moment of intersection between past, present and future, where they all collide in the perception of the one observing it. Looking at it offers the possibility of revelation. Intertextual echoes create a literary as well as a spiritual beyond, but in the end, the writer is not granted more than a glimpse of the world intimated by the presence of the glacier. Instead, she is thrown back on personal relationships, time spent in the laboratory. The poems Thresholds and Salinometer show us a different balance between the actual and the metaphorical, employing the particulars of scientific investigation. The thresholds referred to or implied in the poem are physical experiences of abstract emotional states expressed through simple verbs and the language of fact, and recall the threshold experience of the sublime. In the poem, creatures in an aquarium are being investigated to discover the impact of a warming climate on marine life and are, metaphorically, burning up because of the increase in water temperature. Their condition, the physical fate of humanity, and the emotional state of the poet and scientist are bound together. In Salinometer, terms and definitions, rather than conditions, are set next to a pared-down poetic vocabulary. I tell him about other kinds of stress and flux, ludus, storage, mania. He tells me P waves and S waves are determined by elastic parameters. By setting the languages next to one another, but identified as separate, both gain an emotional resonance amplified in the dialogic structure of the poem and its setting. Both Jean McNeil and Elizabeth Bradfield employ ice terms and their definitions as part of their work, making evident the inherently poetic qualities of words from text which are intended for practical use. They evoke a verbal icescape within and through which there exists an emotional landscape of memory and desire. Here, too, it could be said that a combination of the prosaic, depersonalized descriptions from the American Practical Navigator and A Glossary of Ice Terms with personal meditations is another instance of the empirical sublime as a style which evokes something of the particular experience of travelling through the Antarctic ice. Bradfield's Notes on Ice in Bowditch are arranged alphabetically to suggest regularity and order, stasis and stability, further compounded by words in the initial definitions such as solid, anchor, atlas, boundary. This ice is chartable with boundaries. However, the definition for ice blink in this first section alerts us to something different. Ice blink is a whitish glare on low clouds above an accumulation of distant ice. Boundaries dissolve materially and in language. The term itself is suggestive of a bodily response in the face of too much brightness, and heralds a state of endless metaphor. Experienced navigators examine the sky for signs of ice and open water. Travelling through this landscape is a kind of reading. Bradfield's choice of the word notes for these meditations on ice is suggestive of study, incompleteness, the compilation of evidence from a particular experiential point of view. This is the direction of thought pursued in the second of the Notes on Ice, where ice is conceived in terms of relationship and measurement. The individual is the starting point of the measurement, which takes place in an unstable medium, ice and water and sky, time and desire. The effect of such writing, rooted in observations of the natural world, specifically ice, gives rise to a sense of human relationship embedded in it, to an affective geography. The empirical sublime is a form of writing which acknowledges the scientific and embodies a disrupted chronology which breaches the boundaries between the perception of self and the environment, thus enabling a fresh relationship, achieves what Emily Brady argued is possible, a material experience of the world that resists human appropriation, in her defence of the sublime as an aesthetic category. Whilst knowledge and relationship becomes mixed with the ice which is the subject of their poems, ice retains its distance, its otherness, and in McNeil's work in particular, its spiritual mystery. 5-Year Checkup, 2017, is one of the last Hybern in Towards Antarctica, and in it the problematic ethics of writing and travel in Antarctica are explored in the context of global warming. Bradfield's observational judgment is uncertain, relative, dependent on her own eyes and the observation of the interrelationships of the non-human animals and the environment around her. The vast catastrophe, the hyper-object that is global warming, is too big to see at once, and the human body an insufficient instrument to measure it. The big picture? We chug along. I'm no gauge, my stick too short to measure true. The observer is implicated in the environment, humbled out of certainty by its scale and the potential catastrophe it represents. The journey towards Antarctica makes no claims for the privileged position of the narrator or the writer's voice, for the reader in relation to the text, or for one genre over the other. Textually, the form requires us to respond to the dissolution of generic boundaries between image, prose and poem with a different way of seeing the world. In Epilogue, A Letter Home, Bradfield addresses her home nation. America, I want all of us to know wild places in this way. Her movement from Antarctica to wild places suggests that, just as the science carried out on the continent has a global significance, its poetry and literature has something to tell us about our literary responses to the wider environment. In the empirical sublime, we can find a language which gives expression to conceptual understanding of the workings of the material world, as well as our emotional responses to it. It can hold in balance the possibility of meaningful action and helplessness in the face of climate change. Thank you for listening.